And someone who has been predicting this or at least warning about this for a number of years now is Professor John Mearsheimer. He's the Wendell Harrison Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and one of the most renowned scholars of international relations in the world. Thank you very much, Professor Mearsheimer, for speaking with us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So let me start off by asking you, you're one of the few international scholars who's been warning about this potential invasion of Ukraine, that Russia is getting provoked by NATO's eastward expansion, and that at some point Putin will be forced to respond, and now he has. 50 days into this war, what is your assessment of how far this war has come, what Putin's motivations were to start it in the first place, and the reaction of the Western world to this war?
Well, let's just start by talking about why Putin did what he has done. My view all along has been that this crisis, which now is an actual war, is all about the West's efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. It all started back in April 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, where NATO announced that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO at some point. The Russians, and Putin in particular, made it unequivocally clear at that time that this was crossing a red line. This was unacceptable. This represented an existential threat to Russia. They made that very clear. The crisis broke out on February 22nd, 2014, and the West responded by doubling down. And when President Biden moved into the White House in January of 2021, he went further than the Trump administration did in backing Ukraine. And we, in effect, were crossing a red line. We were presenting an existential threat to the Russians. And the Russians made this unequivocally clear to us, and we continued to double down. And the end result is on February 24th of this year, Putin invaded Ukraine. Now, many people say that Putin invaded Ukraine because he wants to conquer Ukraine and integrate it into a greater Russia. He's interested in recreating the Soviet Union. This is nonsense. There's no evidence to support that. This is all about NATO expansion and more generally, the West's efforts to make Ukraine a bulwark, a Western bulwark on Russia's borders.
So if that was the objective, that Putin wanted to send out a message to the West, to NATO, and to Ukraine, that Ukraine's membership of NATO for him is anathema, it's an existential threat, as you said. A limited war, a war which would have lasted a few weeks, like what we saw in Crimea in 2014, would have sent that message across. Now, as we approach the 50th day, and we're getting increasingly these reports of mass crimes in Bucha and at the railway station a few days ago, where does that leave Putin, just in terms of the objective that he set out to achieve and where he's placed now? Is he worse off today than he was 50 days ago?
Well, it's very hard to say because this war has not played itself out yet. There's no question that he was pursuing what I would call a limited aim strategy. He wanted to conquer some territory in Ukraine, mainly in the east, and he was interested in either regime change or getting the existing regime to change its policy with regard to joining NATO or joining the West. There's no question that the Russian military forces have run into a buzzsaw with the Ukrainians. And this is because NATO, and especially the United States, has been supporting Ukraine all along and trying to turn Ukraine into a de facto member of NATO. That's why Ukraine has performed so well on the battlefield. So the Russians have had their hands full, but the Russians are doubling down now, and where this all leads is very hard to say. And you just want to remember, the Russians view what's happening in Ukraine as an existential threat. And if the Russians lose in Ukraine And at the same time, the West succeeds at strangling the Russian economy. There will be very powerful pressures brought to bear on Putin to escalate the crisis, to possibly use nuclear weapons. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not making the argument that that is likely. I'm just saying that is a real possibility. You want to remember, Putin views this set of events that's taking place in Ukraine as an existential threat. And when states face existential threats, the historical record is very clear here. They pursue risky policies. So I think we're in dangerous waters here because it's not clear the Russians are going to prevail.
So you talked about nuclear weapons, and we've seen sort of rhetoric around that, tactical nukes. We've already seen in this war, cluster bombs being used, hypersonic missiles being used. We had Peskov a few weeks ago suggesting that if Russia were to be threatened, if it's an existential threat, as you said, then tactical nukes cannot be ruled out. Where would be that red line? So far, the rest of the world is looking at this war as a limited conflict. It's limited to Russia and Ukraine. Where is that red line, which if it is crossed, then the West, either through the United States or its European partners, will have to inevitably get into this conflict with boots on the ground? Where's that red line?
Well, it's hard to say definitively where the red line is, but it's very clear that if the Ukrainian military does very well against the Russian military in the upcoming offensive that the Russians are going to launch in eastern Ukraine, and the Russian forces are really being clobbered by all these Ukrainian drones and Javelin missiles and so forth and so on, and that all this Western intelligence that's being provided to the Ukrainians is a huge force multiplier. If the Russian military begins to fall apart, I think you're then going to be in a very dangerous situation. And if at the same time the Russian economy is really beginning to hurt and is even on the verge of collapsing, I think at that point, the Russians will think very seriously about trying to rescue the situation with nuclear weapons. Again, I'm not saying that's likely, but I believe the West is playing with fire here. And more importantly, what we're doing is we're leading Ukraine down the path to destruction. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, this is a catastrophe. And I've argued from the beginning. Right. I argued back in the early 1990s. I was virtually the only person in the West who argued that Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons because I said there was always a possibility that someday the Russians would come knocking and those nuclear weapons would be an excellent deterrent, as every Indian watching this show fully understands. But the West foolishly made Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons. Then the West foolishly led Ukraine to poke the Russian bear in the eye with NATO expansion, causing this crisis. And then once the crisis broke out, the West pushed Ukraine to double down, and the West itself doubled down. And the end result is Ukraine is getting wrecked.
Now coming to, this conflict has gone on for almost 2 months now. There are reports that Vladimir Putin is getting impatient because the initial strategy, which you said, was either a regime change or to get this regime to back off on NATO commitments. That doesn't seem to have played out according to plan. So he's changed his objectives now to, quote unquote, the liberation of Donbass and possibly getting direct access to the Black Sea by capturing ports like Mariupol. What are you picking up in terms of, Putin's brought in a new general to lead the operations in eastern Ukraine, somebody who was in charge of the operations in Syria. He's supposedly given a deadline of May 9th, which is Victory Day, to achieve this limited objective. Do you reckon that it would be possible at all that Putin would get his troops to get some kind of limited by V-Day?
I don't think so. I think, first of all, the Russian army has not performed well at all. And it's hard to believe that that's going to change overnight just because they put a new general in charge. It could gradually change over a process of months, but I don't see an overnight change. The other thing is, if the Russian military does well against the Ukrainians, the Americans will go to great lengths, as will the Europeans, West Europeans and East Europeans, to help the Ukrainians rescue the situation. You want to remember that we're in a situation here where the Russians feel that they can't lose. And the Americans and their European allies feel that they can't lose. It would be a humiliating defeat for the United States, and especially for President Biden, if we were to lose this war and was to win a great victory. So we will go to great lengths to keep Ukraine fighting. You know, as I've often said, we're going to fight to the last Ukrainian. And the Russians are going to fight like crazy to make sure that they don't lose. So the question you have to ask yourself is, where does this all end? And to argue it's likely to end by May 9th, I don't think so. And in fact, there are a number of reasonable people in the United States and in Western Europe who are arguing that this war is likely to go on for years. It may go on at a lower level than it's now going on, but this war could go on for many years. And if you ask me, this is a prescription for disaster, because the potential for an accident or some sort of incident that brings the West into the fight, or creates a situation where nuclear weapons are used, is always there. And a war that's long facilitates big trouble.
It's interesting you say this war could go on for a number of years. Of course, with Vladimir Putin, anything is possible. But if you were to compare his previous military operations, whether it was Crimea or even in Georgia, the South Ossetia one, those didn't last more than a few weeks. So two questions. One, given what we've seen of the Russian military and the sort of beating it's taken over the last a month and a half, do you see the propensity to continue this for a longer time? Or B, do you see that Putin now reassessing and making his limited objectives the liberation of Donbass and direct access to the sea, and then saying, okay, we've won? Because even when he invaded on the 24th of February, he called it a special military operation. It was not characterized as a war or a great patriotic war, as we've seen in the past.
Well, a number of points. First of all, you compared this conflict in Ukraine with what happened in Georgia in August 2008. And you pointed out quite correctly, that was a quick war. And of course, when the Russians took Crimea in March of 2014, that happened very quickly. There was hardly any fighting. This is a fundamentally different situation because the Americans are backing the Ukrainians. The Americans abandoned the Georgians in 2008, and the Georgians were on their own, and they lost quickly. In 2014, with regard to Crimea, we didn't help Ukraine fight to keep Crimea. Here, the United States and its European allies, or its NATO allies, are deeply involved in the fight. And as you know, the United States has an enormous amount of sophisticated technology. It's an enormously rich country, and it can do a lot to help Ukraine stay in the fight. And I think that's what's happening here. Now, with regard to Putin, Putin has to stay in the fight. He can't lose. It would be a disaster for him politically, but it would be a disaster for his country. Again, he views this as an existential threat. So Putin, in my opinion, is not going to quit. I don't see the Americans quitting. And I don't think the Ukrainians have the agency by themselves to stop this one. And for that reason, I find it hard to see how this one comes to an end anytime soon. Now, I may be wrong. I've been wrong on a number of occasions in predicting how international events will play out. And I hope that I'm wrong here. I hope that they work out some sort of peace agreement and this war is put to rest. But I would not bet a lot of money on it. And I don't know many people who think that I'm wrong on this one. But again, I may be.
What may that peace agreement, if at all one were to happen, what may be the broad contours of that peace agreement? What would Putin want to see in that peace agreement for him to say, okay, let's stop with the hostilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I believe that the solution to this whole problem has been there from the beginning. Uh, and the problem that we now face is it's hard to implement. But the solution is that Ukraine abandons any interest in becoming a part of NATO and becoming a Western bulwark on Russia's border. That means that the solution is for Ukraine to become a neutral country and to work out some sort of modus vivendi with Russia. Uh,
Mhm.
the fact is that Russia is a very powerful state. It's much more powerful than Ukraine. It can do enormous damage to Ukraine, as we're witnessing. And therefore, it's sad to say, but it's true. The Ukrainians really don't have much choice to accommodate the Russians to a large extent. Poking a stick in the Russians' eye is a prescription for disaster. So, a neutral Ukraine is the solution, and it's been the solution all along. But I don't see how you get a neutral Ukraine at this point in time, because a neutral Ukraine would be a victory for Russia. It would be a victory for Ukraine too. But the problem is it would make the Americans and their European allies very unhappy because Ukraine would then not be in NATO. And furthermore, inside of Ukraine itself, it would make the far right very unhappy. This is why Zelensky has remarkably little maneuver room, because on his right are a large number of Ukrainians who don't want him to make any concessions to the Russians. And those far right elements in Ukraine, coupled with America's unwillingness to see Russia win in any way, means that Ukraine itself is unlikely to be able to push for neutral country.
One of the fallouts, Professor Mearsheimer, of this, maybe it was not a consequence of this war, but certainly we have seen events play out in that way, is a coming together and a much more closer partnership between China and Russia. What may be the long-term sort of implications of that? Because even during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China, there was a division between them. So that was okay by America because they didn't want the Soviet Union and China to come together. Whereas now, given the way this war has played out, and the Chinese president and the Russian president have called their relationship a friendship without limits, how worrisome would it be for the West and in particular for America if China and Russia were to come together in some form of a long-term strategic partnership?
For the United States, there is one serious threat in the world today, and it's China. It is not Russia. China is a peer competitor. It threatens to be a regional hegemon in Asia. The United States should be focusing laser like on China. It should be working overtime to think about how to contain China. And at the same time, it should be working with Russia as an ally to help contain China. India, Russia, the United States should all be on the same side of the ledger, all bent on containing China, because China has the potential to be a remarkably powerful country. Instead, what the United States has foolishly done is it has picked a fight with Russia. It is bogged down in Eastern Europe. It has done remarkably little in Asia, especially in East Asia, to explain to its allies how it plans to contain China because it's too busy thinking about how to fight the Russians. And we shouldn't be fighting the Russians. We should be working to have some sort of alliance with the Russians, again, all for the purposes of containing China. But we're not doing that. This tells you very simply that there's one winner as a result of this Ukraine war, and that winner is China.
One final word. Where does that leave countries like India? India has its own reservations and concerns with aggressive Chinese behavior. I'm sure you followed the developments at our northern border over the last couple of years. And now, with this whole Russia Ukraine situation, there seems to be the feeling that India and the United States, who are also strategic partners, may not necessarily be on the same page. After all, India's abstained from all the votes at the United Nations. Even Joe Biden called India somewhat shaky, his words. Do you see some kind of a rupture there? And what is the elbow room for countries like India, which are stacked up against China?
I don't think that American unhappiness with India, and there's no question the Biden administration is unhappy with India, as uh, President Biden made clear to Mr. Modi yesterday. So we're unhappy, or the administration is unhappy, but it doesn't matter very much. The United States needs India. The United States has a rich history of having fundamental disagreements with India, and we've gotten used to that. But more importantly, we need India for purposes of containing China. So I don't think there's any serious danger of a rupture in relations between the two countries. I think from India's point of view, it is not a good thing that the Americans are bogged down in Eastern Europe and have lost sight of the importance of the China threat, because India, the United States, and Russia, as I said before, should all be on the same page vis-a-vis China. We're in this rather bizarre situation where it makes no strategic sense for the United States to be trying to drive a wedge between India and Russia. If anything, we should be happy that they're working together, but we can't be, because we are in this remarkably foolish war in Ukraine. And you want to remember, we're not doing any of the actual fighting now, but we are deeply involved. We're doing everything but the fighting. And all of our sort of intellectual capital is being focused on Eastern Europe now. We're not thinking about how to deal with China. And again, this is, from our point of view, a terrible situation. But you never want to lose sight of the fact that it's Ukraine that is paying the greatest price here. This country is being destroyed. And I argued long ago that this is what would happen, right? I'm not saying that this is justified. I'm just saying that this is what happens when you poke a great power like Russia in the eye and you present it with an existential threat. You do not want to underestimate how ruthless great powers can be. And this includes the United States of America as well as Russia when they think they're facing an existential threat.